wife and movie star. Now these periods are descriptive rather than analytical. And here I want to take the first one first. I'm not going to read this, but these are some names that are important, some historical information which I actually got from Lucy Campos' Cine about the Spanish impact on Filipino cinema. Historians should not simply probe localized cultural responses to cinema as a new form, a new method of technological representation. We must also focus on specific films and specific programs that exhibitors construct out of them, with their distinctive content and potential meaning. In this respect, comparisons can prove invaluable. The Chronofotografo, a Romo Demi Chronophotograph, and the Cinematografo, the Lumiere Cinematograph, which was shown in Manila during 1897 and so constituted the cinema's novelty era, shared many points in common. First, both the Chronofotografo and the Cinematografo, despite their presentation in the Spanish language, were French machines with international pretensions. This was echoed by Perturer's connection with the United States in the Columbian Exposition, as well as Liebman and Peretz's European but non-Spanish status. Likewise, although Ramos was a Spanish officer, his wife was Russian. These are the names that are sort of here on Google. All of this is to suggest a certain kind of cosmopolitan sophistication among the personnel involved in bringing cinema to the Philippines. Ramos' motion picture programs, reproduced in Nick Ocampo's book, detailed the international, outward-looking nature of these exhibitions. In ways that were powerful and even today, I think, quite moving, the Lumiere Cinematograph showed the world to members of this aspiring nation. Arab and Africans, French cities, the Baths, the Milan, Hyde Park in London, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, Mexico, a rural festival in Switzerland, and the Russian Tsar. The Russian Tsar, in fact, proved the most extensively covered subject, with 4 of the 30 films on this topic. Perhaps because Ramos' wife, because of Ramos' wife's national heritage. The Spanish influence was present, but the emphasis was on dance, for instance, bolero dancers, in the first program. The third program included a scene in Madrid, but also one of the former Spanish colony, a native market in Mexico. The first of Ramos' programs emphasized the exotic, a parade of Arabs at an exposition, Africans dancing in the streets, as well as a snowball fight. Several films were former European colonies that had achieved independence, including Mexico. Of course, as you know, the Philippines have once been a target province in Mexico. And the United States, while others were of European landmarks. This dizzying array reveals the cosmopolitan quality of these early programs, which resonated with the cosmopolitan nature of Manila itself. Certainly the fact that the Cinematografo showed the world to Filipinos, many of whose descendants would become overseas workers and the nation's most prized exports, has a certain poignancy. From the very first programs, Filipinos were using cinema as a window onto the world. They were already looking outward and using cinema as a way to bring the world to them. Early film practitioners were able to establish, shape, and even completely change cultural meanings in the ways that counter any notion, I think, that cinema was essentially a technological novelty, largely free of ideological resonances, beyond its own expression of modernity. That is, what happened in different countries and different cities at different times, even with the same Lumiere films, was radically different. So again, let's consider the powerful ideological message of the Lumiere's project as articulated by their early films and screenings in France. These films celebrated the family, in particular the Lumiere family, with films like Feeding the Baby. They celebrated the nation with scenes of various national landmarks, for instance, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, or the Tuileries Gardens, also in Paris, or the Champs-Élysées. And they celebrated the state with numerous scenes of the French army. I think like 16 or 18% of the films taken by the Lumieres were military scenes. So films like Charging 7th Cavalry. So here we have women who were dutiful and adoring mothers, not performers in the theatrical world, as was generally the case with early American films. Family, nation, and state would later be the call words of the Vichy government during World War II, of the kind of right-wing French government that was dealing with the Nazis during World War II. And by 1895, 1896, the Lumieres had already found their cinematic equivalents. Given the strong nationalist bent, one can really understand why the appearance of the cinematograph, which is generally treated in the most utopic terms by international film studies communities, why the cinematograph is still greeted with overt hostility by Vietnamese scholars and archivists. The cinematograph is part of the French Empire, of French culture and technological prowess. For the Vietnamese, it must have been a not-so-subtle display of their rulers' powers and concerns. So the Lumiere project is flexible, and its programs open to revision. When the French cinematograph appeared in the United States, its views of Europe and the world meant that the French machine assumed the internationalist and cosmopolitan position. In contrast to the local scenes and nationalist rhetoric of the U.S. companies such as Edison and Biograph, who really were doing in the United States what the Lumieres were doing in France. And yet, the Lumiere military scenes were enthusiastically received in the United States and became a staple of the Lumiere American programs. With its emphasis on charging cavalry and the military training of various European armies, cinematograph's internationalism was of a very particular kind. It encouraged viewers to compare the armies of different European powers and to speculate about the possible outcomes if these diverse forces were to someday clash, as of course they did in World War I. It is noteworthy, therefore, that such military films were almost entirely lacking from the cinematograph screenings of Manila. These offered a utopic yearning to escape the local, as well as the violence and instability of war. It's hardly surprising then that these films found such a ready reception in the Philippines. The views constructed a phantasmatic world that Milananos could embrace. Through a careful selection of films and a change in exhibition context, Lumiere exhibitions embodied a nationalistic discourse in one setting, in France, articulated a militaristic internationalism in another, like New York, offered a colonialist agenda in its colonies like Vietnam, and provided other places, such as Manila and perhaps Bangkok, with a cosmopolitan internationalism that might offer an implicit alternative to the colonial regimes of non-French powers. This diversity of meaning is quite a remarkable achievement, and impressive with the subtlety and diversity. So from the outset, the cinema in Manila was already distinct, engaging its audiences and engaged by its audiences in particular ways. It was already in some sense Filipino, in that it implicitly promoted a common longing of a people towards a better future. There was a utopian component to these offerings. In short, these exhibitions were not simply a delayed repetition of screenings at the center or ideological articulations of dominant imperial powers. The cinema was localized, that is, a global phenomenon adapted to and appropriated for local needs and culture. Okay. The second period, cinema in Manila, 1898 to 1902. Cinema as an extension of the U.S. military occupation. Now, at the end of 1899, an American showman passing through Manila reported, and I'm going to just read this quote here, that several semi-professionals were, with phonographs, cinematographs, etc., are coining money by showing right among the soldiers, this is the U.S. soldiers, on the firing line, where several entertainments have been interrupted by a night attack of insurgents or a false alarm. Any tent, church, barn serves as a theater. Now, evidence of these showmen occasionally appeared in English-language newspapers. Nick Ocampo has found advertisements for a company claiming to offer the Biograph in early 1899. And here's an advertisement that we found for the latest Edison Novelty Company, which showed films a little later in 1899. There was probably another one of those semi-professional companies. Their shows on Escolta Street may have been an effort to tap a civilian audience as well as a few soldiers who were not on the front lines. The Biograph showed a Kuchi-Kuchi dance and a bullfight, films that might appeal to male audience members, U.S. soldiers and perhaps the civilians. And one wonders what films the latest Edison Novelty Company screened. Films related to the Spanish-American War were possible but not to the Filipino-American War, at least during this particular one. Did Americans question or embrace the propaganda? Certainly an enthusiastic response to the Filipinos seemed unlikely. Perhaps they were shown trick and comedy subjects instead,